Okay, hi everybody. My name is Noor Hugstad, Noor. I am the owner and creator of Gutsy by Nutrition, and I'm a nutritional therapist amongst other things, and I'll be talking a little bit more about my qualifications. But this is the third talk in a series that I've done for the Conquering Chronic Illness group that Peter runs. And so thank you very much, Peter, and everyone for hosting me again. I've done two other talks, one on the four biotics and one on Gut Health 101. And this talk today, as you can see, is about the gut-brain axis. And this is a critical axis for physical and mental health. And I have a whole lot of information for you and also some simple solutions to try and improve the health of that axis and therefore your physical and mental health. So just to talk about, just to mention again, so I'm going to talk about the science around the gut-brain axis and how exactly it impacts your physical and mental health. And then I'm going to come up with some simple but powerful things that you can do to improve the health of this axis and therefore your gut health, your overall systemic health, and your brain health, which is particularly important these days with so many people suffering from things like brain fog, dementia, etc. So yes, as I was saying, a lot of my clients, and you hear a lot more about it, people suffering from things like brain fog, fatigue, lethargy, issues with memory and recall, lack of motivation. And on the other hand, a lot of people having ongoing digestive problems. And what I'm about is looking at the root cause of these things. So not just addressing the signs and symptoms of these, perhaps using drugs or other things, but getting to what's underlying, what's causing these issues, which can lead down the line over time to things, as I mentioned, like dementia, which starts about 30 years, 25, 30 years before you actually get a diagnosis. So just a little bit about me. Some of you have attended the other talks would have seen this already, but my history and how I came to this. I had fibromyalgia since 19 years old. I now know that I have something called EDS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which was triggered by living in Southeast Asia for a while. I've over the years, I thought I was pretty healthy, but then as I started to get older, couldn't get away with things anymore, and I got quite sick for a while. Migraines twice a week. Growing food sensitivities, I had no idea what they were at the time. I was always interested in health, but didn't really understand what was going on. Couldn't get any help from anybody, traditional Western medicine or otherwise. And finally, somebody recommended I get off gluten, which was the beginning of my healing and learning journey, and to me becoming a nutritional therapist myself. I've done a lot of in-depth gut and brain work. I suffered from Sears mold illness for a while, which really was devastating. And then I've done a lot of mindset work as well, which has actually been quite amazing. I couldn't tolerate any supplements, and it's helped me to be able to tolerate that, to get over food intolerance and air hunger I've had for many years since my teens, and stress that wasn't going away. So I am a functional nutritional therapist. I'm a transformation coach, which is a kind of mindset life coaching. I'm an integrative health coach. I've done a lot of training in lab courses, so through restorative wellness, which is gut, hormones, blood chemistry, and I do other testing as well. Hair tissue mineral analysis is something that I've done more recently. I trained with Tom O'Brien in person as a gluten-free practitioner. And I also was a yoga teacher, became a yoga teacher. And so I find the breath a very powerful tool in stress reduction and health as well. I think that some people might think, though, that I just look at gut health and digestive health. And while this is important in my practice because it is a gateway, it's sort of like our command and control center, it's not everything. So I look at different things from different angles: inflammation and immunity, hormone and thyroid imbalances, cardiovascular, kidney and adrenal health, autoimmune disease. I have quite a lot of clients with autoimmune disease, detoxification, including from heavy metals and that sort of thing, and chronic health conditions. And as I mentioned, I do use lab testing, I use muscle testing, I use extensive questionnaires based on signs and symptoms, and in-depth health history. So there are a number of tools that I use in my practice. So I will get through the talk first. If you have any questions, put them in the chat box and I'll answer them after the talk, or you can ask them in person afterwards. I'll give you an opportunity. So write them down and I'll be happy to answer them afterwards. So the gut-brain connection, and this is just a bit of an image of what your gut is. Your gut is your entire digestive system, from what happens in your mouth with chewing, in your stomach, down through all of your intestines, out through the colon where waste comes out. It also involves your gallbladder, your pancreas with enzymes, your liver. So it's a very extensive system and a critical system because it's our means of taking in food and interacting with the world, along with things like our lungs. It's one of the main ways that we evolve and cope with our environment. So the gut-brain axis, what is this exactly? It's a close bidirectional relationship between our gut and our brain. What this means is if our brain is not functioning well, this can cause gut problems. And if our gut is not functioning optimally, this can affect brain function and our mood. So this can become a cyclic kind of issue if there is dysfunction in any one or both of those areas, one playing off the other and leading to a bit of a downward spiral. The gut is actually our second brain. It's called the enteric nervous system. And we actually have more neurons or brain cells there than in our brain. And it's our body's biggest neurologic system. So when we think of our brain, we really need to think of it in two parts, and one supporting or bringing down the other. Interestingly, in human development, the gut and brain both develop from the same kind of tissue. The fetus, with the fetus, one part becomes the central nervous system, while the other develops into our gut or enteric system. The way that these two are connected are via the vagus nerve, and I think you've had somebody talk about the importance of the vagus nerve, but I'm going to talk about that as well in terms of how it affects your gut and brain health. So yes, the gut has a large semi-autonomous brain, you may not know it is also part of the hormone signaling system. So hormones are messengers, so it's an important part of creating messengers in the body, across the entire body. And this system is very elaborate. As I mentioned, the vagus nerve, and you can see in the image there, it runs from the back of the brain through the brainstem, comes around here, down the front of the neck, down through the sternum, and reaches out to all the gut organs. So it's the way that we exchange information between our brain and organs. And it's the longest, the 10th longest of the 12 cranial nerves originating in this back brain stem in the back of our head. And actually, we think of it as one thing, but it actually has two branches: the parasympathetic control, which is our rest and digest mode of most of our organs. We cannot digest if our system is in a sympathetic or fight and flight mode. So we must be in parasympathetic or our relaxed mode. And it's also part of our social engagement system. And this is something that exists in mammals only, apparently. So these are some of the ways that the vagus nerve affects our organs. In our gut, it regulates our gastric juices, so the things that break down our food, our proteins, our carbs, and our fats. it impacts gut motility, which is the muscle movement, the contractions, or it's also called peristalsis, that moves our food down through our system and our waste out of our system. And when that is stuck, and that can be due to nerve damage or all sorts of, or brain damage, then that can be a real problem, because those things and toxins stay in our system too long, which can lead to all sorts of gut health problems. And it helps to regulate stomach acidity, which is a critical gateway, if you'd watch my first talk, in terms of breaking food down, so that the rest of the body can use the nutrients that it makes available to us. In terms of the brain, the vagus nerve lowers anxiety and depression, and it opposes our sympathetic response. So we need a sympathetic or fight and flight response sometimes, but we also need balance. So it's important for that, for regulating that. In our heart, the vagus nerve helps to lower our heart rate if it's too high, and with vascular tone, so the tone of our blood vessel system. In the liver, the vagus nerve regulates insulin secretion. Insulin is how we use sugars in our body. It's the hormone or messenger that gets sugars or energy into our cells. And glucose homeostasis, so the balance of blood sugar in our system, which is critical to our energy levels and to our brain health. It plays a very big part in brain health. The vagus nerve, in terms of inflammation, suppresses that, which is important because inflammation is implicated in 90% of disease. And vascular, and I think I mentioned above that it decreases tone and helps to lower our blood pressure if it's too high. Here are some signs and symptoms of vagus nerve dysfunction. If someone comes to me and they have trouble swallowing, food, tablets, water, even then, that can be a real sign that the vagus nerve is not active enough. If someone has a low or no gag reflex, that is another sign. If you listen to someone's digestive system and it doesn't gurgle, that's another sign. Constipation and diarrhea can also be signs and symptoms. Poor motility, so as I mentioned, when those contractions aren't happening to move the food, which can lead to infections and toxicity in the body. That's another sign and symptoms. And it's also associated with a range of gut diagnoses like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, weight gain or loss, chronic fatigue, depression, bradycardia and tachycardia, peptic ulcers, gastroparesis, chronic inflammation, and epilepsy. So yes, vagus nerve dysfunction and leaky gut. The vagus nerve, when it's inhibited, can cause intestinal permeability. So intestinal permeability, our gut lining, our small and our large intestine, has a thin one cell thick lining, which is where a lot of our immune system lies. And in our colon, it's where our body helps create some vitamins, B vitamins and vitamin D. But in our small intestine, which is where we absorb foods, it can compromise gut function, meaning that our small intestine lining can become damaged. The junctions in that area are meant to be tight like this, but when we have leaky gut, those junctions open up, and that can allow parasites and bacteria, viral infections through that normally shouldn't come through. So that intestinal permeability can compromise our gut function. If you have leaky gut, intestinal permeability, it can lead to leaky brain, which can lead to inflammation in the brain. And leaky brain is a biomarker for depression and psychiatric disorders. And what happens is that when your vagus nerve is not functioning properly, it It stops digestion from happening properly. So your food is not broken down properly. That unbroken down food or cannot be absorbed, so you don't have enough nutrients for your cells to work properly. That food that isn't broken down properly will damage the lining of the gut, and that will cause that intestinal permeability, so those junctions to come apart. Those large food particles that aren't broken down properly will get into the bloodstream, which causes inflammation because the body doesn't recognize them, and the immune system will tag them as hostile, and when the immune system attacks something, that's what we call inflammation. Now you've got that inflammation in the bloodstream, it becomes systemic, and it crosses that barrier into the brain. So I hope that explains how leaky gut often leads to leaky brain. So brain dysfunction and the vagus nerve. If the brain is traumatized through injury, for example, or degenerated through this kind of inflammatory process, or is generally in poor health, blood flow, you can start to see now it's this kind of cyclic thing between the gut and the brain. Blood flow to the intestines is inhibited, causing leaky gut, as I just discussed. And just like I explained, pathogens, which can be bacteria, viruses, perhaps they haven't been killed off because of insufficient stomach acid, parasites, unbroken down food can enter the bloodstream. And a particularly dangerous thing is something called LPS, or large molecules that are released by these pathogens, by these nasty bacteria and things. And this is quite dangerous. It can trigger systemic inflammation. And it's this inflammatory link, as I mentioned, that's linked to depression, anxiety. And this triggers the brain's immune system, which increases inflammation in the brain and further degeneration in gut health. And so you get this kind of vicious cycle that I was talking about before. I thought I'd give you an example. Marit is actually my cousin. My family is originally from Holland. I hadn't spoken to her for quite a while, and I found out that she'd had a traumatic brain injury. So she had had a fall at work and hit her head, not hugely hard, but it resulted in serious injury. She couldn't sleep. She was in a lot of pain. She couldn't work. She basically couldn't do much at all. She couldn't function. And she had a team of 4 different specialists who, over 18 months, she'd seen no progress at all. So she reached out to me and we worked on her diet. For brain injury, a more keto style diet can be very helpful because it's anti-inflammatory. We worked on her gut health. We reduced her gut and brain inflammation through a protocol of supplements, targeted supplements. It took us a little while to experiment with that. And she was also quite depleted in some ways. And I explained to her that to get a traumatic brain injury like that, her brain must have been primed. And what happens is her brain, by that I mean her brain must have already been in an inflamed state. And she told me that she'd actually had celiac disease, done nothing particular to heal from that, even though she was off gluten. And so she had this pre-existing inflammation, one fall, and there it was. She had this traumatic brain injury. And as you can see her quote there, what a GP, neurologist, company doctor and rehab doctor couldn't do, you did. And she is now able to go back to work part-time, 4 or 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. She is off all drugs. She's able to sleep a lot better. Things are not perfect, but she's much more functional than she was. So this is the power of what food and supplements can do. If you're interested in signs and symptoms of neuroinflammation, and while these can be fairly common these days, they're not. They actually are signs of something that you probably need to resolve. Brain fog, which is, as I mentioned before, is pretty common. Brain fatigue after eating or an exposure to chemicals. variable mental speed, so sometimes just not being able to think as fast as you want, and reduced mental endurance. So perhaps you're able to really focus on something for a day before, whereas now it's half an hour or however long. So they're signs of mild neuroinflammation, so inflammation in the brain. Moderate signs are depression, drowsiness, lethargy, low motivation, and an inability to concentrate for long at all. And some severe can be as severe as dementia and seizures, trembling and twitching, confusion, disorientation. And severe is also involved in Parkinson's disease. And I wanted to give you an example of the link between the gut and the brain with Parkinson's. 80% of people who have Parkinson's are constipated. So that goes back to that inflammation in the brain, inflammation in the gut, working off each other, affecting the overall health, and eventually in some people leading to Parkinson's. A little bit more about the link between chronic inflammation in the body and brain with depression and anxiety. So there's a large body of research that suggests that depression is linked to chronic inflammation and oxidative stress. So inflammation, while it's the body's natural defense mechanism to injury or threat, too much inflammation, as I said, is linked with disease. And oxidative stress, we have free radicals. That's a natural thing that happens in our body. And these days we probably meet more in our environment than we ever used to, with chemicals and radiation and different things, and drugs as well. When your body's inflamed and your diet might not be right for you, your body can't counteract these or detoxify the harmful effects, and this can lead to disease as well. There's actually no evidence. Once we used to think that our brain was chemically imbalanced, and that was causing depression and anxiety. And while neurotransmitters can be involved, this chemical imbalance theory has never been able to be proven. Interesting the way that some antidepressants might work. It's thought to be because they lower inflammation, but we're not really sure. I wanted to give you a visual image of what depression and anxiety are like in a brain, and the link between brain health and them. So you can see a healthy brain on the left from those different angles. And these are images from an MRI, and then a brain that is of someone who has anxiety and depression. And you can see how kind of wholly it is. And this can be, as I said, linked with this, often with inflammation. I have this on my website, which is gutsybynutrition.com.au, so if you want to look at these later, but it's something that I commonly refer my clients to, vagal nerve exercises. You have to do them quite vigorously and every day, and it's not necessarily pleasant, but if you do them twice a day aggressively, over time, these can make a real difference to strengthening that connection between the gut and brain, and allowing the brain and the digestive system to go in that proper rest and digest mode, and to allow the healing to begin. So gargling 2 to 3 times a day. And if you have chronic issues, it's something that's good to do continuously for the rest of your life. And I certainly do them every day as well, for that reason. Singing loudly to music in the car, at home, wherever you. So that stimulates the back of the throat, and the vagus nerve comes down here. So that stimulates things there. Gagging. So what I do after brushing my teeth, I use a tongue scraper and I put it right at the back of my throat, and do that aggressively 3 to 5 times at least. Again, it's not pleasant, but it's only a few minutes out of your day. It's not too bad. yoga or breath work, yoga with breath work or pranayama alone, breathing. So with a longer exhale than an inhale in meditation, stimulate your parasympathetic rest and digest mode. And when you breathe calmly, for example, and with your exhale longer than your inhale, it's impossible to be in a fight or flight or sympathetic nervous state. So that's something you can always use to calm things down, and particularly before you eat, that can be useful. And coffee enemas, people swear by them, but it can be hard to begin. But once you begin doing them, they can really help stimulate the vagus nerve. It works by distending the intestines, so expanding them, and that can help stimulate the nerves there. And some people who have compromised muscle movement motility, that can really help a lot. It can also stimulate the gallbladder and liver to function better, which can also help with that motility and just with general gut health as well. So the kinds of things that you would use this for are just general gut health, keeping that connection, that vagus nerve connection, healthy, but is particularly useful in research for autoimmunity, rheumatoid arthritis, irritable bowel disease, asthma, diabetes, obesity, migraines, seizures, and depression. I want to talk a bit now about nutrients and the chemistry of emotion. So we're going to talk about neurotransmitters here. Brain cell levels and brain chemistry are all impacted by what we eat, movement, and by stress. In terms of eating, this includes the intake of and the balance of essential fats. Many of us eat way too many inflammatory omega-6 fats, which is things like vegetable oils. And we also need healthy levels of protein, minerals, and vitamins for that chemistry to be balanced. And if our body can't, and our brain can't access these nutrients due to maybe a poor diet or compromised gut health, where we can't break down or absorb and use those nutrients, then we're unable to produce sufficient proteins, or when broken down, they're called amino acids, to build neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are built on amino acids or proteins. And this can lead to anger, depression, when we have imbalances there, anxiety, hyperactivity, drug and alcohol cravings, addiction, and just general bad moods. Who wants that? Neurotransmitters are brain chemicals that relay information between our brain cells or neurons. They impact our brain function, our mood, and even our personality. Our gut bacteria make neurotransmitters, and in fact, they make more neurotransmitters than our brain does. So both our brain and gut make them, but our gut makes more. There are many hundreds of, I think about 300 types of neurotransmitters, but our gut is involved in making the 7 primary ones, and you've probably heard about serotonin and maybe acetylcholine, adrenaline, and some of the other ones mentioned there. And these are from our gut, are sent to our brain, but some are stored there as well. So our gut makes and stores critical neurotransmitters. And it's unable to do that if it's not functioning well. But it also goes both ways. The microbiome, or the flora that exists in our large intestine, also called our colon, where our small intestine is relatively sterile, so it's our large intestine that plays this role. Our gut flora here are affected by our experiences and our emotions. So our experiences and emotions turn gut microbes. In turn, our gut microbes send chemicals, including neurotransmitters and hormones, that affect our memory, emotions, and behavior in key parts of our brain. And our gut microbes can even alter gene expression in terms of what happens in our gut and across our body. So our thoughts, experiences, emotion affect the gut flora, and then gut flora send chemical messages through as neurotransmitters and hormones that affect how our brain works. just a little bit about neurotransmitters. So you would have heard of adrenaline, which is our survival or fight and flight neurotransmitter, GABA, which is calming. It's sort of like an anti-anxiety thing. People who have anxiety often have low GABA, but supplementing with it is not necessarily the best things, because there can be other things going on, and so that can actually make it worse. Noradrenaline, which is another step up, that's about concentration and focus. Dopamine it gives us pleasure, and it's often what people are looking for who have addictions. They get a hit of dopamine, which makes them feel good. Glutamate is our memory. This is the most common neurotransmitter we have by far. Endorphins, you would have heard of that sort of euphoria. Serotonin, as I mentioned before, is about our mood, and that's really our happy feeling, our well-being feeling, and that's heavily involved in sleep. And acetylcholine, which is about thought, creativity, learning, memory. So you can see how critical these are, and these are all in, our gut is involved in producing and storing a lot of these. So I've already talked a bit about gut health and nutrient depletion. And as I mentioned before, poor gut health causes nutritional deficiencies, because if we don't have enough stomach acid or digestive enzymes, nutrients won't be broken down. If they're not broken down, they can't be absorbed properly, and therefore our body cannot make neurotransmitters, which means that our brain cannot access them, and our brain also can't access the other critical things it needs for health, and fatty acids and proteins are very important for that. And we need a lot of these nutrients too to help fight inflammation and oxidative stress. Signs and symptoms of gut issues, and I've talked about a lot about these in my first talk: constipation and or diarrhea, and it's not uncommon for people to have both. Gas, bloating, cramping, pain, just general discomfort. Reflux or GERD, which is heartburn, or what people often call indigestion. Food intolerance or allergies, and I talked about that, how that can happen with that leaky gut and improperly broken down food damaged in the gut to cause that permeability. IBS and autoimmune diseases of the gut. Bacterial imbalances are also important in terms of gut health. And there's something called dysbiosis, which is a lack of balance between the bacteria in our large intestine or colon. We have different types of bacteria. We have beneficial or commensal ones, which confer direct benefits onto us. They, for example, help, they feed the cells in our gut lining. They help our gut lining, our gut immunity, which is in our gut lining. They help our gut lining and our gut to create those vitamin B's and D's and A's that I mentioned before. We also have opportunistic bacteria, which don't help or harm us unless they're not under check. We have limited real estate in our colon, if you like to see it that way, and all these bacteria are fighting to take hold. So if we have a low amount of beneficial bacteria, then these opportunistic ones will start to take over, and that can cause health problems. And then we have pathogenic ones, bacteria which are directly involved in disease, and that can be everything from diseases in the brain to bladder infections to pneumonia and some quite serious diseases as well. The other issue that can happen in terms of bacterial imbalances is a low diversity of bacteria. And with our modern lifestyle, the chemicals that is in our water system, in the air, sprayed onto our foods, etc., and drugs and things like that, it can kill off a lot of our bacteria and reduce the diversity. And for example, tribes in Africa who don't have access to any of this and live a more traditional lifestyle, they have a much greater, I think it's 10 times bacterial diversity in their gut than we have. And I saw, I think in the media the other day, that they'd managed to analyze the gut bacteria diversity in a mummified body many thousands of years old, and the diversity was again far greater than ours. And this low diversity, and sometimes critical strains of bacteria even missing, such as Akkermansia, which is linked to autism, for example. So it can be that important. And other things that low diversity are linked to is again anxiety, depression, as I mentioned, autism, schizophrenia, and other mental health and mood issues. And this happens via neurotransmitters. So it's bacteria are that important. I can't really talk about gut health without talking about Roundup and the impacts of that, also known as glyphosate. It's a herbicide or weed killer, and it affects bacteria, enzymes, and nutrients, and much more. And while these pathways that it impacts are not human or animal pathways, they do affect our bacteria. So the research that Monsanto gets away with is saying it doesn't affect human or animal pathways, but the problem is it does impact our healthy bacteria. And given that 90% of human DNA, our DNA in our body, it comes from our bacteria in this critical, mutually dependent symbiotic relationship, you can see how important that can be. So 90% of our DNA is not our own. It belongs to our bacteria, and this is what is impacted by Roundup. Also, many of our cells are human. So our cells in our body are not human. It depends on which sort of research you look at. We don't know definitively, but 30 to 60% of our cells are not human. And what Roundup does in terms of this good gut flora is it hinders it from being healthy. It actually stops the chemical reactions that these gut flora are involved with in, for example, breaking down foods to create these things that feed our cells and promote healthy gut immunity and create vitamins. It actually hinders that process. And also it deletes 9 of these essential amino acids, these proteins that are the building blocks of our neurotransmitters. So I remember seeing a talk by a neurologist who said that in the 1970s, they were saying that in 30 years or so, they expected to see a whole lot of brain disease, such as dementia, from Roundup. And sure enough, the levels of dementia and Parkinson's have gone up considerably. And in fact, a couple of years ago, dementia was about to overtake heart disease as the greatest cause of death amongst Australians. Just giving you one example of gut bacteria and neurotransmitters, serotonin, which, as I said, is our happy sort of well-being chemical. And it's responsible for transmitting messages between our nerve cells or brain cells. When we have dysbiosis, this lack of bacterial balance in our colon or our gut, it can be associated, and when we have low levels of serotonin, this is associated with depression and mood imbalances and sleep problems too. So, and more specifically, to give you an example of the bacteria that are involved in serotonin production, Streptococcus and Enterococcus help make serotonin. So we need healthy balances of that, not too many, but not too few. Again, we need a functioning digestive system with access to proteins to be able to make the neurotransmitter serotonin, and we need a healthy diet in order to feed and create balance of that bacteria, and in this case Streptococcus and Enterococcus, to make that neurotransmitter. And just a scientific quote don't worry about it too much if it kind of affects your brain. But manipulations of the microbiota, so the flora in our gut, and manipulations, for example, are antibiotics or diet or infections, can have profound knock-on effects on the brain function and mental well-being. And yeah, don't worry about the rest. But that's just a quote that I thought I would give you. Blood sugar. Now, why am I mentioning that? Blood sugar, whenever you look at brain or gut health, is fundamental. It's glucose is our brain's main source of fuel. It's our body's main source of fuel. And when blood sugar is unstable, high or low, or alternating up and high, whereas it's meant to be sort of going like this in a steady sort of stable band rather than up and down like this, this can actually cause degeneration and dysfunction of the brain. And you can see that by that diagram there. Eating too many carbs, it increases your blood sugar. Your body tries to cope with that with the hormone insulin. It secretes a lot of that. Your cells say, hang on, I've got too much, I've got enough energy. They become insensitive to the insulin. They can't take any more of that sugar in. That leads to increased fat storage, particularly around the belly area. You get these kind of swings of low and high blood sugar, eventually leading to diabetes, which is permanently high blood sugar. And your energy and mood can swing a lot of it along with this. And then when you're in a low, you get carb cravings and you eat more carbs in this kind of vicious cycle. All of that creating brain degeneration. Sugar and refined carbs are the most inflammatory foods you can eat. And why? Because it puts the body into a constant state of stress. So it puts out cortisol and adrenaline and noradrenaline. Too much of the time. We need that sometimes, of course, to survive and be healthy. But when we're chronically in this kind of stress state from eating sugar or caffeine, which also acts like sugar in the body, alcohol and things like that, then our body is in this constant state of stress. Sugar and refined carbs also reduces stomach acid. When we have reduced stomach acid, as I mentioned, that leads to food not being digested, and this damage to the gut lining, leading to leaky gut. And sugar also feeds overgrowth, bacterial overgrowth, fungus and yeast, and so on. Stress. Yeah, this is a big one. And the more I practice, the more I realize how critical stress is to our health. Stress is rampant. Too much stress is rampant in our society. The problem with stress is it's our survival, so it overrides everything. It overrides normal and healthy, balanced gut and brain function too. And why? Again, because it switches on our emergency hormones. So, and when we're in an emergency state, it switches off our digestion, leading to dysfunction. It switches off healing, cell repair, and growth. And it puts us constantly in this state where our adrenals become exhausted from constantly pumping out these emergency hormones. So, you know, I say to people, all the good food in the world won't undo the damage of stress because it's such a big override on our system. It's our survival. So as I said, it switches off digestion, our immune system and cell repair, leading to disease eventually. Stress, as I said, can be caused, just to summarize, by mental and emotional issues, but sugar in all forms, and by that I mean refined carbs too, and caffeine. So all of those act as very similar kind of stress on the body because they all trigger our emergency. So the stress, our gut and our brain, I mentioned that has a profound effect on the brain by changing the microbiome in our gut, or the balance. Even one short event can do that. And stress also favors the growth of certain gram-negative organisms. So bacteria that can be harmful, that can damage the gut lining. And this was a good quote. So this intestinal barrier damage translates to all other permeability barriers within the body, including in the brain, also in the lungs, and other areas of the body. So stress damages our gut lining, and the lining, the barrier between our brain and other organs in the body. There was a paper in earlier this year, looking at early onset Alzheimer's disease in an animal model, and it confirmed again that a compromised gut can lead to compromised hippocampus barrier, and that's a part of the brain here, leading and actually causes damage in the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is responsible for learning, memorization, memory recall, and emotions. And this can manifest as a diverse range of problems and disorders across the body. Don't worry about this image too much, but I'll just get my arrow and I'll show you. So here is the brain. Here is the vagus nerve here. If you can see where my arrow is here, the vagus nerve running down here. This is the limbic system in the brain. And this is where the vagus nerve comes out here. And you can see what stress and emotions does. It affects all these parts of the limbic system, including that hippocampus I just talked about here. And that can affect our nerves, gut nerves here, our vagus nerve itself, and the cells involved in that through the spinal cord are impacted. This can cause inflammation, cytokines, inflammatory components, which can impact the gut. And this is the bloodstream on this side. This is our gut here. And it can affect the hormone cells in our gut. And again, here, when we have an imbalance here, you can see it's starting to damage. This is the lining of our intestine, that one cell lining that I talked about. It can damage that lining, get through, and this can then go back into the brain, impact that. So, and these hormones, these stress hormones here, you can see are impacting through what's happening in the brain, the composition of our gut bacteria, and it can alter them so it's unhealthy. So I don't know if you can see clearly, there's that sort of link between the brain causing issues in the gut and the gut causing issues in the brain. What drives stress? I've mentioned quite a few things already, but pretty much our modern diet and lifestyle. That they disrupt the gut and are inflammatory. Sugar, refined carbs, caffeine, I mentioned, life stress, so chronic problems in people's lives. Environmental toxins, we talked about glyphosate, also pesticides, heavy metals, things like mold in the environment, parasites. Antibiotics, drugs, and alcohol are destructive on the gut. A lack of movement. It's been shown that we need movement in order to get the muscle contractions going, working properly in our small and large intestines, but also systemically they move things around and make us feel better as well. We're made to move, basically, and mental, emotional stresses, things like trauma, unhealthy beliefs that might have come from childhood, which once helped us to survive, but are no longer benefiting us. Adverse childhood experiences. There's a whole lot of research showing how that can impact our health directly, and abuse, brain injury, death or divorce, and those sorts of things. So I guess the point here is that, life happens, but when you pile one thing on top of the other, when you compile all the drugs we take, especially over-the-counter ones, we don't move enough, when we have these mental, emotional life events, when we don't eat well, when we're drinking too much to try and resolve the stress, when there are toxins in our diet, this can make our stress bucket kind of overflow and impact our health. So in this day and age, we really have to be a bit more conscious about looking after, reducing stress in our life and looking after ourselves. Just want to talk a bit more about thoughts and emotions, and how they can impact us. Thoughts actually cause our brain to release neurotransmitters, these messengers, which communicate with other parts of the brain and our entire nervous system. And they control most of our body functions, from our feelings to our hormones and to our digestion. So negative emotions, and this is not just sort of woohoo, this is all researched. Negative emotions trigger the amygdala, so in the limbic brain, the back of our brain, to send out a red alert, activating the fight or flight stress response. So a thought is not just a thing, a process, but something that actually influences other things. So it leads to a cascade of reactions across the body. Research shows that thought alone can actually grow muscles. There's plenty of research done on humans where we can actually grow muscle just by thinking about it. It can raise your immunity and create other physiological changes, so other physical changes in your body, including how your genes express. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Thought alone can also lead to bad habits, chemical addictions. Interestingly, if you have a sensitivity to a food caused by leaky gut, that will trigger an adrenal kind of response, and adrenaline will come out, which gives us a bit of a buzz, a bit of a lift, which we can get addicted to. So we can get caught in a negative cycle there. And that reaction in ourselves can keep us caught in this negative loop where we actually can crave the foods that really aren't helping us, because we're sensitive to them, and that creates an inflammatory response. And our subconscious beliefs, we now know a lot more about our subconscious. It actually influences 95% of our thoughts and actions, whereas our conscious mind, we think we're in control, but influences about 5%. That's because our subconscious is where we hold memories and values, perceptions and beliefs, which establish our identity and our reality and the limits of what we can achieve, including in terms of our health and weight and our ability to heal our body. So quote by Henry Ford, famous one: if you believe you can, or if you believe you can't, you're right. So we literally are what we believe. I said I was going to talk a little bit about genetics and our internal environment. So epigenetics, which is, we used to think our genetics just happened. They were in control of us, but now we know that 90% of our health is controlled by our environment: food, stress, toxins, exercise, beliefs, which triggers our genes so it can switch them on or off. So thoughts, feelings, and beliefs alter how our genes express themselves. And if you picture what I was talking about before, our thoughts affect our microbiome affects our thoughts and how our genes express. So you can start to see this connection here. So when we think something, just to repeat what I said before, our brain releases neurotransmitters which control our body's functions. So just to reinforce that, and interestingly, just to sort of highlight the importance of that, each of our 30 to 40 trillion cells that exist in our body have thousands of receptors for neurotransmitters. And each receptor, interestingly, only responds to one type of protein or neurotransmitter. So if you feel sadness or happiness, that emotion will release specific proteins called neuropeptides. So a kind of peptide, a protein from related to each emotion. And when they connect with the cell receptors, they actually can change the structure of that cell. And so when that cell divides, which is part of what happens in our body all the time. So the new one will have a lot more of that particular protein receptor. So you can say that happy thoughts create happy receptive cells and sad thoughts create sad receptive cells. And these impact your health by changing the expression of your genes. So put together this stuff about how the mind and the gut relate. Thoughts, emotions, and beliefs are electrochemical occurrences in our nerve cells that produce a cascade of physical changes, including in our gut. So positive, loving thoughts release love hormone, oxytocin, and this regulates metabolism and supports growth and cell health. And fearful, negative thoughts release stress hormones, which shut down your digestion, lower your gut health, inhibit your cells' growth, stop your immune system from functioning properly and your cells from repairing. But the good thing is that our cells are constantly being renewed, and so we can change there, and therefore our health. Our cells, after all, are the building blocks of our body. So just to summarize on all of that, if you see here, our brain influences through the vagus nerve, the muscle contractions in our gut, the secretion, the healthy secretions that our gut puts out, the delivery of nutrients to our body, the balance of microbes, whether that's healthy or we have infections there. Our gut, where our microbes, healthy microbes, our gut flora live, influences our neurotransmitters, our stress, mood, anxiety, and behavior. So that's a quick summary of the relationship between our gut and brain. This is another summary, a little bit more technical. Don't worry about it too much. But here's our brain. Here's our gut, or our enteric nervous system, where our gut microbiota live, all that flora. There's this relationship here through the autonomic nervous system. So our brain affects our gut through what our microbes produce, healthy or negative, influences how our brain functions. Here's the environmental influences I was talking about. So things like stress. It talks here about, your health, the support that you have for your health, adverse events in your childhood, that sort of thing. And then other factors are diet, the pathogens, so things that come into our body or around us. Have we developed antibodies sufficiently, etc., which impact our gut? And then both of these affect our immunity. So our gut is involved in our immunity. It's where 80% of our immunity lies. And then our brain impacts our immunity as well through stress. The HPA axis is the axis from the brain through the pituitary to the adrenals, through the sympathetic nervous system. So that's your fight and flight nervous system mode. And then if there are issues here with our immunity, that can lead to inflammation, which is these cytokines, and priming the brain for problems. So that's just a bit of a more scientific diagram that summarizes what I was talking about before. So what can we do? Eat real food. What is real food? It's food as natural as we can get it. Wild caught healthy proteins with some good fats, like here in this fish, and nuts and seeds. Eggs have a lot of good fats and proteins in them. Avocados, good fats and other nutrients. We need a lot of fiber, so through all our vegetables. Apples here have pectin in them, which is gut healing. All this fiber here feeds our healthy gut flora so that they can flourish and compete properly, crowd out any pathogenic or any other opportunistic bacteria that are trying to take control. We have herbs and things like here, ginger and turmeric, but basically every person, especially when they're healing, needs different kind of diet. But Real food is basically single ingredients, grown as naturally as possible, preferably without chemicals, pesticides, that sort of thing, and unprocessed as possible. Some specific gut brain health foods, leafy greens are amazing. They not only feed good gut bacteria, but they are full of anti-inflammatory components that our body loves. Prebiotic foods. I gave a whole talk about the biotics that the body needs, especially, and that feeds, they are basically fiber that our body cannot break down, but we rely on our gut flora to do that. And why do we need that to happen? Because our gut flora then create food for our cells where our immunity and everything else lies. So that's foods like onions, Jerusalem artichoke, raw asparagus, cold potatoes, raw green banana. And I have posts on this as well on my website. Walnuts and almonds. It's interesting, walnuts actually look like a brain and they are brain food. Coconut oil is a great fat for your brain. Fish and omega-3 fats, as I mentioned before, we tend to eat a lot more omega-6 fats. That's the toxic and unstable vegetable oils. A lot of them are full of GMO, made from great GMO grains and things as well. But we need to eat more things like flax seeds, hemp seeds, fish, those kinds of things, avocado that give us the healthy omega-3 fats, which are anti-inflammatory and feed our brain. Every cell in our body needs good fat for its membrane, and our brain in particular needs good fats, and it survives on cholesterol as well. Fermented foods, things like sauerkraut and kefir and natto, as I mentioned, hemp, chia, pumpkin seeds, and fruits like berries and apples, so your lower sugar fruits. A lot of people don't necessarily want to hear that, but if you have issues with your gut or brain, while you're doing some healing, and generally as a lifestyle thing, eliminating sugar is probably the number one thing, and gluten and dairy and alcohol. Gluten causes leaky gut. So it causes in everybody those tight junctions to come apart because it releases a chemical called zonulin, which we naturally need a little bit in our gut, but it is high in zonulin. It invokes that reaction. So we let things into the bloodstream on the other side that shouldn't be there. Gluten, modern gluten is very hybridized, GMO, and all sorts of other things have happened to it. In the 70s, it was radically changed from the old wheat, was changed from the old kind of wheat that we used to have. And it has new proteins in it, which our body has not historically evolved to recognize or handle, and that can cause all sorts of issues with inflammation and in our gut and brain too. Gluten, dairy, and sugar all cause inflammatory priming reactions in the brain, so inflame the brain, and immune responses that can actually destroy brain tissue. And in terms of alcohol, people like to talk about the benefits of alcohol, but a lot of research shows that the harm of alcohol outweighs the benefits. And especially if you're looking at brain health and gut health, it shrinks grey matter, impacting memory and learning. It's a depressant, it's toxic, lowers your good bacterial and diversity, causes leaky gut, again, those tight junctions to pull apart and let unhealthy things through, maldigestion and malabsorption, sorry. What else can you do? Heal your gut, so restore balance. I mentioned the prebiotics before, so veggies 3 times a day is a great thing to do. Feeding your good gut bacteria with those live foods that I mentioned before, and things like sprouts as well. Healing leaky gut with gut healing foods. Apple sauce made at home and unfrozen. I have a recipe on that for my website showing you how to do it. Have to cook it to a certain point. The pectin in that can is healing for the gut, and bone broth as well. Now, sometimes people cannot tolerate these foods if they've got histamine issues, for example. Bone broth is not great for that. So it's very individual, but these are some general things that you can do. Eating the right fats, I mentioned before, the omega-3 fats. I've got lists of that on my website as well if you want to know the full list, but I've mentioned some. And limiting drugs, especially over-the-counter ones. Drugs, anytime you have a drug, it will change. Even one lot of paracetamol in a gut stool test, you can tell for 3 to 4 months afterwards, you'll get a comment from the lab saying, probably taken paracetamol in the last 3-4 months because of this imbalance here. So antibiotics, people think, they can take multiple lots of antibiotics without any impact on the body, but it takes around 2 years for the bacteria, the healthy bacteria in the gut, to recover in terms of amount and diversity after one course of antibiotics. So sometimes obviously we need to take certain things, but just be aware of trying to limit them wherever possible. What I do in my clinic, and this is very individualized because people are at different, have different needs at different times, depending on what's going on. It's called, you probably heard about and I've talked about this before, the 5 R's protocol. So removing infections and poor foods, replacing things that need to be replaced, like low stomach acid, digestive enzymes. It's very, very common for people to have some reflux or just low stomach acid, resulting in low protein in the blood, which means that, of course, you're not going to be able to make the right balance of neurotransmitters and have the proteins that your brain needs, for example. Re-inoculate, so really bringing up those beneficial bacteria, crowding out the bad, repairing any damage done to the gut lining and immunity, and rebalancing also that. So that's diet and lifestyle, your environment. Are you in the right environment? And emotions. And people need to stop. Often practitioners use a one size fits all approach, but with my clients, especially people with chronic illness and autoimmunity, for example, you might have to do a lot of calming the immune system and repairing the gut before you even start to look at removing infections. So it's very individual. What I do in my practice, I use signs and symptoms questionnaires and extensive health history, and I have all sorts of questionnaires, including on neurotransmitters, so they can provide a lot of information and what's going on in your hormones and all sorts of things. And I also do, as I mentioned before, a lot of lab testing in terms of the gut health, microbiome testing, so stool testing can be very informative. And here is what you get, for example, from microbiome mapping: stool color and consistency. Is there any blood or mucus? And that might require investigation. It just depends. Inflammation levels in the gut, it will tell you. Do you have enough digestive enzymes or not coming from your pancreas? Your pancreas is a dual organ. It also is responsible for managing blood sugar, and it can get very tired with constant sort of higher carb diet. So, and we talked about that before. It will tell you if your fat digestion is good or not. If you have intestinal permeability, it actually gives zonulin levels. Are you detoxing properly? How are you reacting to gluten if you eat gluten, or gliadin is the proper name for the band of proteins. What's your gut immunity like? And a lot of my clients have very low gut immunity, so it's really important to bring that up because the gut is where most of our immunity lies. Do you have any parasitic or worm infections? Do you have any of those bacterial infections or imbalances? Are your good bacteria low, or sometimes they can get high and cause problems too? But often, chronically, what I see is people have low good bacteria. I'd say 99% of people who I have stool testing, whether they're chronically ill or not, they have low good bacteria. So this is a really big problem, I think. Candida or yeast fungal infections, you'll get information on the balances between the two main Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes kingdoms of bacteria, and they need to be in balance as well. The stomach infection Helicobacter pylori, H. pylori, can be important in the rest of your digestive health, and short chain fatty acid levels. So those are the things that your gut bacteria create that feed the lining, the gut lining and the cells. But as I said, I don't just do that, although food and the gut are sort of gateway issues into health that always need to be considered. Sometimes we need other things, like with my cousin, we did a specific brain health protocol. I had a lot of clients in perimenopause or men in andropause, which is a kind of male hormone imbalance. And we might need to do thyroid hormone testing. That's increasingly common, I'm finding. Or there might be other health overrides. And when I talk about overrides, they're crises that the body is having that need to be addressed along with other issues before you can calm everything else down. So every person is different. So yes, diet and stress, as I mentioned several million times, are foundational. And I always say you wouldn't put suboptimal fuel and beat a car up, for example, and never service it and expect it to form properly. And it's exactly the same with your body. And I think some of us, when we're younger, we think we can get away with things, and then something happens. We might get something that can spark a whole cascade of illness. And just remembering that stress overrides everything. So it's a very real thing. And as I mentioned, I'm increasingly seeing how critical that is at a very deep level to our cells. And I explained how our cells are influenced by our thoughts, conscious or subconscious. Lowering stress, food and environment, talked about that a lot. I'm not going to repeat that. Dealing with the root causes of ongoing mental and emotional stress. Very simple things, making time for yourself, moving regularly if you can, if you're able. But even if you're maybe a bit chair bound, when my mother in her later years, I gave her a chair yoga practice, which made a big difference to her well-being. So there's almost always something that you can do. Some people like to find a spiritual base or some sort of connection that grounds them and brings them into themselves, rather than being outside of themselves and being prey to the stresses of life. Meditation has been shown through research to have a huge effect on the health, the physical health of your body, as well as mental health. Spending time in nature, which is sort of how we're made, doing fun stuff, and getting the support, coaching, counseling, whatever, ways to cope with whatever is happening in your life. And it's not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of stress, and it's going to help you take you forward in your life and your health. Removing household toxins is really important. Foods that are GMO, sprayed with pesticides and fungicides. I've talked about that. Chemicals in personal groomings. There are a lot of hormones, artificial hormones and chemicals that affect our immunity, that create hormonal imbalances in the messengers in our body. So really being more careful about that. And there are some relatively affordable brands out there, so it's not that difficult to find that affordable versions these days. Household cleaners, mosquito sprays, all those sorts of things. Tidying those up in your house is important. Fluoride in water. Fluoride is Lancet, which is probably the world's most conservative medical journal, has labelled fluoride as a neurotoxin, and yet it's in our water. So having a water filter is really important to brain health as well. I wouldn't discount that at all, but also just generally staying hydrated. I'd say that 50-60% of my clients do not hydrate properly. And that's a huge factor in all general health. And I've literally seen people, by increasing their water, going from anxiety to calmness. So it plays a big factor in general health and mental health. mold and air pollution, they can bring your whole health down, as I've experienced and I mentioned before. And understand the effects of medications on your gut and brain health, including over-the-counter ones, and really taking things only when necessary. Yeah, and as I mentioned, moving and sweating regularly if you can is detoxifying. It gets your gut going. It systemically moves things around, helps you to detoxify, and it's good for mental health. So as Hippocrates said, all disease begins in the gut, but that doesn't necessarily explain what caused our gut health problems in the first place, including everything that feeds the body and the mind. So it's those stresses. Getting to the root cause is what I'm about. And I use a whole approach, combining nutritional therapy with mindset work where appropriate. And I've had clients who've been chronically ill and down to 5 foods who were making great progress, but still, for example, one client couldn't take a lot of supplements. If she needed 10 drops of something, she was only able to have 1. And we were slowly building that up, but she attended a workshop that I gave on the mind-body connection. And she had a breakthrough after doing that. We did a particular exercise in that, and she was able to go from 2 drops to the 10 drops and doing the full general protocols. So just a little bit of proof at how important that can be and how influential on our health and how our tolerances and all sorts of things. So yes, I do optimize gut and brain health, mood and mental health, resolving mental and emotional blockages where that is a factor. So maximizing your chances from using that multi-pronged approach to create balance and wellness in the body. Yeah, so what I do is, provide a roadmap forward. So our most precious resource, our health, which money, well, it can go some way to buying, but not all the way. So having energy and clarity and being able to focus and live the life that you want and age healthily, rather than being in pain. It's freedom, isn't it? This left-hand picture is a group of carers that I gave a series of workshops a couple of years ago. These are the people that were willing to be photographed, and it was a wonderful experience. And here are some students that I helped to teach. If you're interested, I'm not going to give a big sales talk, but I do offer a free 20-minute discovery call. I will put that in the chat in the minute. It's bit.ly/book GBN, and you don't have to worry about capitalization or not, but you can also just book through my website, gutsybynutrition.com.au. On the contact page, there are several ways you can contact me there or book this discovery call. And this is my email, info@gutsybynutrition.com.au.